When you're talking about the 1920s, obviously you can't just start in 1920 and pretend like nothing happened prior to that. Not only are events going to happen in 1919 that we sort of lump in with the 20s, but you have to think about what happened during World War One. Obviously, the United States did not get involved until late in the war, and Wilson tried to spread his bubble idealism around the world. And you could see that Henry Cabot Lodge and the reservationists and even the irreconcilables really were saying we don't want to be part of international affairs. We want to, quote unquote, as Warren Harding would say in the 1920 election, return to normalcy. And when you think about what return to normalcy means, it's going backwards in some ways to traditional gender roles, despite the fact that women had just earned the right to vote in the 19th Amendment, staying out of world affairs, being focused nationally and not internationally, cracking down on others. Now, of course, the others, quote unquote, African Americans, we've seen that all the way through the Gilded Age following Reconstruction, but we're still going to see an uptick in violence towards African Americans as we see the Klan coming back. And now we're going to have, as we saw in the late 1890s, all the way through the early 1900s, a reaction against Southern and Eastern Europeans, particularly Jews who've come in from these lands, as well as Catholics. And again, we've seen that all the way going back to the Irish coming in the late 1840s. But it too, we're going to see resistance against that. So in this sort of environment of a return to normalcy, we do have, as we talked about with the images last Friday, we have this sort of traditional mindset, and we also have modern-ish, moving forward. And in as much as I'd sort of like to break it down between modern and traditional, or roaring and roiling, it's pretty tough to do that narrative and sort of, dichotomous one or the other. So as you follow along, it's important to think about what you would classify sort of as the darkness and what you'd classify as the light, because that certainly is something that we can think about as we're preparing for an essay. So when we think about what's going on with other, we have to really sort of continue that tradition of anti-immigrant. Obviously, we've seen this with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 82 and 92, and then, of course, in 1902 and Japanese Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907. But when we're thinking anti-immigrant now, there's a particular concern about Bolshevism. Of course, the Russian Revolution has happened in 1917. There's some real uncertainty about what that all means. So as you're going into this anti-Bolshevism, you have what's known as the Red Scare. And we're going to really have the first Red Scare in the 20s and the second Red Scare in the 1950s. And when you're thinking about what happens in the Red Scare, it in some ways is similar to 2017 in that the Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, whose name you need to know, decides that it's best to not even really worry about what people's rights might be, but just to get them out. So you see the Palmer raids, where you're going to have about 250 Russian immigrants basically sent home. You see these federal agents breaking into labor unions like the Wobblies, really not paying much attention to sort of the legality of it all. But Palmer said that's somewhat inconsequential, because we need to worry about security and we can't worry about freedom in this time. Now, if you're going to think about how this sort of all culminates in 1921 and then in 1924, there's actually immigration acts, again, sort of recalling what we've seen before, specifically targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans. And of course, 21, 3% of those people that were here in 1910, there was a quota on how many people could come in annually. And then 3 years later in 24, they reduced it to 2%, but go back to the population that was here in 1890. So really sort of continuing that tradition. Now, along with this idea of Bolshevism and other, it sort of bleeds over into labor, because labor had previously been associated with anarchists. Now it's being associated sort of with worldwide Bolshevism, which of course later we'll see in terms of communism. Now, it doesn't help that in 1919, right as you're coming out of the war, there are two major strikes, the Seattle General Strike and the steel strike around the country. And people are, saying, just as the economy is coming to a place where we want to be able to come together, Europe is devastated, we can be the big dog here, why are you guys striking? And so there's some real contempt and hostility towards labor unions. And so in the 1920s, as times get better, there's less leverage that labor has, but you're also going to see leverage taken away from unions through something called the American Plan. Now, don't confuse it with the American system, BTN, way back in Henry Clay's day. But the American plan was businesses essentially saying to unions, we will not even negotiate with you, which unions had really sought always as being able to sort of sit down at the table across from the bosses and be able to hammer out a compromise agreement. We're going to see that later on during the New Deal, but during the 20s, labor really took a hard hit. Now, when we think about sort of this anti-other, we've got the continuation of what we've seen in the past with the KKK. Now, as we've seen before in many of the images, this is not the old KKK. This is not a secret organization. This is a very public organization. They're out in the daylight. They've got their hoods off. They're marching on Washington, marching on state capitals. They see themselves as a real political presence who can help people get elected, or in the case of Al Smith, running for the Democrats in 1928, who was from New York, who was Catholic, who was a drinker, they took great credit in helping defeat him. Now, when we think about this new KKK, why are they sort of coming back? And again, you've got African Americans moving from the South to the North, creating racial tensions. You've got the whole sort of nativism that we have relative to Southern and Eastern Europeans. And so you're going to see the Klan come back with, in many ways, with a more sort of social element, or I should say, non-racial element. These are people that want Sunday school. These are people that defend prohibition. They're trying to take America back to sort of traditional morality, which is ironic because actually one of the big movers and shakers within the sort of new Klan was found to have embezzled money and was involved in some really sordid sexual affairs. And so, again, certainly irony there. But the Klan is similar to the way it was in that it still targets African Americans, but now it's going to target Jews and Catholics, people that are sort of broadly associated as other and, again, not 100% American. Now, when we're thinking about sort of this traditional element, particularly in the South, we're going to see the clash of science versus religious beliefs, particularly religious fundamentalism, sort of a literal interpretation of the Bible. And of course, that comes down in Dayton, Tennessee with the Scopes monkey trial. And again, it was sort of all a show for Dayton to sort of have an attraction. And of course, it brought William Jennings Bryan as someone who's going to prosecute John Scopes, even though John Scopes said he did it, versus Clarence Darrow, the most famous trial attorney in America. And at the end of the day, we know that Scopes is going to lose the case. But William Jennings Bryan, as he testifies sort of on behalf of biblical literalism and fundamentalism, can't really prove that the Bible is true, so he looks embarrassed for the cause. But even in that sort of embarrassment, religious fundamentalism didn't take a hit necessarily in the South. People sort of came together and said, everyone's out to get us. Now, at the same time, those people that were in favor of science, in favor of evolution, sort of said, look what we did. We are the more modern party. Now, if we're going to sort of stay with the rural element, those people that were more apt to, maybe be Klan members or creationists, again, I'm not trying to, paint with a broad brush or overgeneralize, but we're speaking of those people that aren't necessarily in cities. Farming took a major hit. Now, after every war, we see this, where farmers produce during war and don't know how to really stop. Okay, add in the fact that there's improvements in machinery, and you're going to get, of course, a huge supply that doesn't meet demand. High, again, lower prices. Farmers don't do well, so they produce more, and so we're going to see many farmers go bankrupt. And just as we sort of saw in the Gilded Age, where they moved to cities, they're going to continue to move to cities. Now, the story is very different when it comes to manufacturing. Because of new technology, you've got industry that is able to improve the lives of many of its workers in terms of getting greater salaries. And again, if people have greater salaries, they can buy more, and that increases demand. And then companies, of course, can produce more and make more money, and then they can pay their employees. And so what you're seeing is a constant cycle about improvement of technology, more money in workers' pockets, being able to spend more, and that's quite good for the economy. You're going to see manufacturing go up. You're going to see people generally making more money. And again, this is all in light of the fact that Europe has been devastated, and the United States really is at the big kids table and at the head of the big kids table when it comes to the economy. Now, when you're thinking about the economy, sort of the best example would be Henry Ford's Model T. Now, this actually, he had perfected it prior to the 1920s, but the 1920s is sort of the heyday of his car. And one of the important things is that it gives rise to a bunch of other related industries, from oil to glass to paint to the essentially roads and bridges construction to the idea of suburbs, steel and rubber. So it really is that game changer in terms of what it can do. Now, when we're talking about cars, it's important to think about what their effect in terms of social life is. So now people can actually move out of the city. Like, you can go to the suburbs. You don't have to be sort of in that inner ring of the city. And if you wanted to leave and just sort of get out of the city on a day trip, you could, in the same way as farmers were able to sort of get away from their farms and the monotony there. People can take vacations, the whole idea of a motor hotel or a motel. Now, one thing that I like to bring up is this really gave this idea of sort of youth freedom or teenage freedom. The idea of the back seat of the car, if you know what that is, it certainly couldn't have happened until there was a car. So giving mobility to both adults and teenagers at the same time. Now, one of the important sort of inventions, which is ultimately going to be a problem both in the 20s and in the early 2000s going up to 2008, is that people didn't need to have the full price of the Model T to buy it. They could buy on credit. That means you put a certain amount down originally, and the seller will say, okay, you'll pay this back over time. That's a way that many people purchased items, particularly big ticket items, through the 1920s, and that bubble will burst as we head towards 1929 with the Great Crash. Now, one of the groups that cars or automobiles at the time were particularly being marketed to were women. And so there's this idea sort of women having freedom now that they have the car. But when we think about women in the 1920s, there's sort of this great misnomer that the 1920s are all about flappers, and everyone is an independent woman, and everyone's going out all night, and everyone's drinking, and everyone's smoking, and everyone's got bobbed hair, and everyone's showing their shoulders and their legs. In reality, there was this group of flappers, absolutely, but sort of not as much as our nostalgic look at the 20s would lead us to believe. Generally speaking, most women went back from the factories that they'd worked in during the war and became housewives again. There were some professional women, but it wasn't like they were doing men's work. They were still confined to women's work, like nursing and secretarial services. So again, don't think that the war really gave rise to this, vanguard of women pushing forward. In many ways, it really was a return to normalcy there. One woman who was pushing the envelope is Margaret Sanger. Now, Margaret Sanger is associated with Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger was the first to really push birth control. And the reason she was pushing birth control originally was to say, look at these poor families, not poor as in unfortunate, but impoverished families who are not practicing birth control. They've got so many mouths to feed, and it's a real struggle. So again, she was pushing sort of to keep the population down, particularly in the cities, and then moving on to the middle class and basically saying you don't need to have as many kids as sort of nature will allow. You can actually have some family planning, and as you go into that, actually sort of saying men and women can sort of enjoy their sexual relationships without necessarily having to worry about having kids. That's more of a middle class ideal. Now, again, going all the way back to Neil Dow in the antebellum era in Maine, who was the mayor of Portland, Maine, who outlawed alcohol. We want to look at Prohibition. We've seen Prohibition coming. We saw it certainly through the Progressive era, and it really will come to fruition as a result of sort of the patriotism of fighting the Germans and quote-unquote indirectly fighting the Irish, sort of the big drinkers, quote-unquote. But at the same time, you sort of have this combination of return to tradition, the rise of the Klan, the idea of religious fundamentalism, anti sort of city. So we will see the Volstead Act, which is actually the legislative way that you actually sort of activate the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, and what was called the Noble Experiment to end the